In many Victorian homes, a daughter's education was careful and thorough. She learned how to receive guests, how to pour tea, how to manage servants and household accounts. She was taught patience, modesty, and the delicate art of emotional restraint. Yet there was one subject that often remained untouched, the subject that would shape the most intimate chapter of her life. In this world, innocence was not simply admired, it was carefully protected, sometimes through silence. Welcome to a quiet moment wrapped in candlelight history. I am Amadeo Francis Hawthorne, your humble guide and storyteller. Tonight we wander together into the forgotten corners of the past. But first, if you don't mind, whisper in the comments where you're listening from and at what hour your candle burns tonight. In Victorian society, daughters were carefully educated for the lives they were expected to lead. They learned how to manage a household, how to receive guests with quiet confidence, and how to maintain the calm dignity that reflected well upon their families. Parents believed these lessons would prepare a young woman for the responsibilities of marriage and the delicate social world she would soon enter. Yet when historians look closely at these carefully planned educations, an unusual question begins to emerge. If daughters were trained with such attention for the duties of adulthood, why were some of the most personal realities of marriage so rarely explained to them in plain language? The answer lies not in neglect, but in a powerful belief shared by many Victorians that innocence itself was a form of moral protection. Within that belief, silence could appear as an act of care, and the absence of certain knowledge could be understood as part of a young woman's virtue. Tonight we explore how that silence shaped the lives of Victorian daughters, and how an education designed to preserve innocence sometimes left young women stepping into marriage guided more by moral language than by clear understanding. Tonight's reading is called The Victorian Daughter: What Girls Were Never Told About Marriage. Chapter 1: The Doctrine of Modesty. To understand why so many Victorian daughters approached adulthood with limited knowledge of their own bodies, we first have to understand the ideas that shaped the world in which they were raised. These ideas were not usually presented as strict rules or formal doctrines within the home, yet they influenced everyday life so deeply that they quietly guided how parents spoke to their children, how daughters were educated, and even which subjects were considered suitable for conversation. One of the most powerful of these ideas was the belief that society was naturally divided into different spheres of responsibility. The public world of work, politics, and commerce was generally associated with men, while the private world of home and family was considered the proper domain of women. Within that domestic sphere, a woman was expected to provide stability, moral guidance, and a sense of refinement that softened the harsher edges of public life. Because this role was seen as morally important, the character of a daughter was treated with particular care. Parents and writers of conduct literature often emphasize the importance of modesty, restraint, and emotional composure. These qualities were believed to form the foundation of a woman's influence within the household, shaping the atmosphere of the home and quietly guiding the behavior of those around her. Advice books written for young women reflected these expectations. They spoke often about kindness, patience, and the cultivation of a calm and thoughtful demeanor. A daughter was encouraged to develop habits of self-control and discretion, learning how to speak gently, how to avoid unnecessary attention, and how to maintain a sense of dignity even in moments of difficulty. Within this framework, innocence came to be regarded as one of a young woman's most valued qualities. Innocence did not simply mean youth or inexperience. It was understood as a form of moral clarity, a reflection of the purity that Victorian culture admired and hoped to preserve. Protecting that innocence was seen as part of a parent's responsibility, and many families believed that certain kinds of knowledge could threaten it. As a result, modesty gradually expanded beyond clothing or outward manners and began to shape the boundaries of conversation itself. Some subjects were discussed openly within the household, especially those connected to religion, domestic management, and the responsibilities of daily life. Other subjects, however, remained surrounded by careful language, gentle hints, or quiet avoidance. A daughter growing up in this atmosphere would quickly learn which topics belonged comfortably in family conversation and which were treated with a certain respectful silence. The lesson was rarely spoken aloud in a direct way, yet it became clear through small signals, through the way adults redirected a conversation, through the softening of language, or through the simple understanding that some questions were better left unasked. Over time, this pattern created a subtle but powerful relationship between knowledge and morality. If innocence was something precious, and if knowledge had the potential to disturb that innocence, then withholding certain information could easily appear as an act of protection. Parents often believed they were preserving their daughter's virtue by ensuring that particular subjects remained distant until marriage or until some later moment when explanation seemed unavoidable. Yet this well-intentioned silence carried consequences that were rarely discussed. A daughter might grow into adulthood with remarkable preparation for the visible responsibilities of her future life. She could manage a household, host guests with grace, and uphold the reputation of her family with quiet confidence. But when the conversation turned toward the private realities that would shape her own marriage, the lessons of childhood often grew very quiet indeed. And it is within that quiet space between careful instruction and deliberate silence that we begin to understand how Victorian daughters stepped into adulthood, guided by strong moral expectations, but often without the knowledge that might have prepared them more fully for the lives ahead. Chapter 2. What She Was Not Told. If we pause for a moment within this carefully structured world, another question begins to surface. A Victorian daughter might receive years of preparation for the visible responsibilities of adulthood, yet many of the most personal aspects of married life were left surrounded by uncertainty. The silence that formed around these subjects was rarely deliberate cruelty. More often it grew naturally from the same cultural beliefs that valued modesty and innocence so highly. In everyday conversation, the language of the body was softened almost beyond recognition. Matters that today might be explained plainly were instead referred to through delicate expressions that revealed little and assumed much. A girl might hear older women speak quietly of being indisposed or unwell, and over time she might gather that these phrases referred to experiences shared among women, yet the full meaning was often left unexplored. This pattern extended beyond casual conversation and into the books that guided domestic education. Manuals written for daughters preparing to manage a household offered remarkably detailed advice about daily life. They described the proper care of linens, the arrangement of meals, and the responsibilities involved in supervising servants or receiving visitors. These books reflected a world that valued order and competence, and they assumed that a young woman would soon be responsible for maintaining both. Yet when these same pages approached the more intimate realities of married life, the tone often shifted. Instead of detailed explanation, the language became cautious and indirect, suggesting duty and affection without describing the physical experiences that lay beneath those words. The reader was expected to understand that marriage would bring new responsibilities, but the nature of those responsibilities remained largely unspoken. For many daughters, this created a quiet contradiction within their upbringing. They were trained to anticipate marriage as the natural destination of adult life, and they were taught to approach it with loyalty and devotion. At the same time, the knowledge that might have clarified what marriage actually required was often postponed, softened, or left entirely unexplained. Within families, mothers sometimes attempted to bridge this gap with brief conversations offered shortly before a daughter's wedding. These discussions were often gentle and careful, shaped by the same modesty that had guided the daughter's upbringing. The intention was usually to reassure rather than to instruct in detail, and so the explanations remained limited, leaving many young women to interpret the meaning of marriage gradually through experience. This quiet uncertainty did not define every Victorian household, and historians can find examples of families who spoke more openly. Yet the broader culture of the 19th century strongly encouraged restraint in matters connected to the body. Even well-educated families often believed that too much knowledge given too early might disturb a young woman's sense of innocence. As a result, many daughters stepped into adulthood with remarkable confidence in the social and domestic skills expected of them, yet with far less clarity about the private dimensions of married life. They understood their duties in the household and the importance of maintaining harmony within the family, but the deeper realities of their own bodies remained something they would learn gradually rather than beforehand. Seen from a modern perspective, this silence can appear puzzling, even unsettling. Yet to those living within Victorian culture, it often seemed entirely consistent with their understanding of virtue. Protecting innocence felt like a responsibility, and the absence of certain explanations was interpreted as a way of preserving moral dignity. And so the daughter who had been carefully prepared for the visible structure of adulthood often entered marriage guided by a strong sense of duty, a deep respect for modesty, and a trust that the life ahead of her would unfold according to the values she had been taught. Chapter 3: Gendered Ignorance. While Victorian daughters were raised within an atmosphere that carefully protected their innocence, the experience of boys within the same society often unfolded quite differently. This contrast did not always appear dramatic within daily life, yet it quietly shaped how knowledge circulated among young people approaching adulthood. Expectations for modesty and restraint applied strongly to both genders in theory. But in practice, the boundaries surrounding knowledge were often drawn more tightly around girls. Many boys encountered fragments of practical information long before marriage through school life, apprenticeships, or the rougher conversations that sometimes took place beyond the immediate supervision of family. These encounters were rarely formal lessons, and they were not always accurate or responsible. Yet they meant that young men often entered adulthood with at least a partial awareness of subjects that remained far more distant from the experience of many young women. Victorian culture frequently justified this difference by appealing to ideas about moral character. A daughter's innocence was considered especially delicate because it symbolized not only her personal virtue but also the reputation of her family. Protecting that innocence, therefore, became a shared social responsibility, reinforced by parents, teachers, and the broader expectations of respectable society. For boys, the situation was interpreted somewhat differently. While moral behavior was certainly expected, many adults assumed that young men would encounter the complexities of the world sooner or later. Knowledge that might be considered dangerous for a daughter was sometimes viewed as an inevitable part of a son's gradual entry into adult life. These assumptions created an uneven landscape of understanding. A young man approaching marriage might possess fragments of knowledge gathered through observation or conversation, however imperfect those fragments might be. A young woman approaching the same moment in life often carried a different kind of preparation, one shaped less by practical explanation and more by the language of duty, modesty, and trust. This difference was not always discussed openly, yet it could influence expectations within marriage itself. Victorian society often assumed that husbands would guide the practical aspects of married life, while wives would contribute moral steadiness and emotional support. Within such a framework, the imbalance of knowledge seemed natural to many observers of the time. Yet from a quieter perspective, we can begin to see how this system placed daughters in a particularly vulnerable position. They were encouraged to approach marriage with sincerity and devotion, trusting that the structure of family life would unfold according to the values they had been taught. At the same time, the limited information available to them meant that many of the experiences awaiting them would be understood only gradually. Historians who examine letters and personal writings from the 19th century occasionally encounter small hints of this imbalance. The language used by newly married women sometimes reflects a process of discovery that unfolded after the wedding rather than before it. These writings rarely describe events directly, yet their tone suggests that the transition into married life could involve moments of uncertainty that few daughters had been prepared to anticipate. Within the cultural logic of the time, however, such uncertainty was rarely interpreted as a failure of education. Instead, it was often understood as part of a young woman's natural passage into adulthood. Marriage itself was expected to reveal knowledge that had previously remained out of sight. And so Victorian society continued to maintain a delicate balance between modesty and experience, one that allowed sons and daughters to approach adulthood through very different paths of understanding. The intention was often to protect virtue and preserve social order, yet the result was a quiet divide that shaped the expectations surrounding marriage for generations of young women. Chapter 4: Private Realities. If we move beyond the ideals expressed in conduct books and social expectations, we begin to glimpse another layer of Victorian life that appeared quietly within private writings. Letters exchanged between friends, personal diaries, and the advice columns that appeared in newspapers sometimes reveal moments when the carefully maintained silence surrounding marriage gave way to uncertainty. These writings rarely describe events in direct or explicit language, yet their tone suggests that many young women encountered aspects of married life that felt unfamiliar and difficult to interpret. Advice columns in 19th century newspapers occasionally received letters from newly married women who struggled to describe the challenges they were experiencing. The questions they asked were often framed cautiously, and the editors who responded usually answered with the same careful language that characterized Victorian public conversation. Even so, these exchanges hint at the reality that some daughters entered marriage with only a partial understanding of what their new lives would involve. The language used in these letters is striking for its restraint. Writers often referred simply to difficulties, confusion, or the challenge of adjusting to the expectations of married life. Because modesty shaped how these subjects could be discussed publicly, the details remained indirect. Yet the emotional tone sometimes carries a quiet sense of discovery that unfolded after the wedding rather than before it. For many women, this adjustment happened gradually. Marriage introduced experiences that had previously existed only as abstract ideas connected to duty and devotion. As weeks and months passed, understanding developed through lived experience rather than formal instruction, and young brides learned to interpret the responsibilities of married life within the privacy of their homes. It is important to remember that Victorian marriage was not defined solely by uncertainty or discomfort. Many couples built affectionate and stable partnerships, and the shared work of maintaining a household often strengthened those relationships over time. Yet the early period of adjustment could still involve moments when a young woman realized that the moral language of her upbringing had not fully prepared her for the practical realities of adult life. Friends sometimes became an informal source of reassurance during this period. Married women who had already passed through the early stages of adjustment occasionally offered guidance to younger brides, sharing their experiences in quiet conversations that remained outside the formal structures of education. In this way, knowledge circulated gradually through networks of trust rather than through the books that had shaped a daughter's earlier upbringing. Seen through these private glimpses, the Victorian system of modesty begins to reveal both its intentions and its limitations. Families believed they were protecting their daughter's virtue by preserving innocence for as long as possible. Yet the transition into marriage sometimes required young women to discover important truths within the very moment when they were expected to demonstrate confidence and composure. This quiet process of discovery rarely appeared in public discussions of Victorian family life. Instead, it remained tucked within letters, diaries, and the cautious language of advice columns, where historians today can still detect the human experiences that unfolded behind the polished ideals of 19th century respectability. And it is within these private traces that we begin to understand how the education of a Victorian daughter, so careful in many ways, could leave certain questions unanswered until the moment when life itself provided the explanation. Epilogue. When we look back across the quiet rooms of a Victorian household, it becomes easier to understand how a daughter's education could feel both careful and incomplete at the same time. The world around her believed it was preparing her well. She was taught how to maintain the dignity of a home, how to welcome guests with warmth and restraint, and how to cultivate the calm moral presence that Victorian culture admired so deeply. In many respects, this education succeeded exactly as intended. Countless young women stepped into adulthood with strong habits of responsibility and an understanding of the social world they were expected to navigate. They knew how to manage households, how to maintain family relationships, and how to contribute to the stability of the communities in which they lived. Yet within that careful preparation, there remained a quiet space where certain knowledge had been deliberately softened or delayed. The values that guided Victorian families encouraged modesty and innocence, and those values shaped not only behavior but also the boundaries of conversation. Protecting virtue often meant allowing some truths to remain unspoken until life itself revealed them. For many daughters, this meant that the transition into marriage carried an element of discovery. The lessons of childhood had provided a framework of duty, patience, and devotion. Yet the deeper realities of adult life unfolded gradually, often within the privacy of the home and the trust of a new relationship. Seen from a distance of more than a century, this system of silence can appear both understandable and complicated. It grew from genuine beliefs about morality, protection, and the preservation of innocence, yet it also shaped the experiences of countless young women who entered adulthood guided more by virtue than by detailed explanation. The story of the Victorian daughter therefore reminds us that history is rarely defined by simple intentions. Families believed they were offering guidance and protection, and in many ways they were. Yet the same values that preserved innocence could also create moments of uncertainty when the realities of life finally arrived. And so we leave our daughter standing once more at the threshold of adulthood, prepared to manage a household, to represent her family with dignity, and to step into the roles society had carefully prepared for her. But the world she is about to enter is larger than the lessons she has received, and the knowledge that shapes her married life will unfold gradually in ways her childhood education rarely described. In our next episode, we step beyond the drawing room and into another Victorian space entirely. Within the studies of doctors, reformers, and moral guardians, a different conversation was taking place, one that asked whether silence truly protected innocence, or whether knowledge itself might serve a different kind of moral purpose.